Floor's yours.
Well, thank you, Chair. Look, I don't want to prolong the debate too much. I want to try and be helpful and supportive of a submission on this bill, and I want to support that submission. But there are really three issues that I think need to be addressed, and unfortunately, my Surface Pro's just basically died on me, so I'll go by notes.
It wasn't me.
It could have been. Look, I think that this bill, as set down, provides for the inclusion of GST. It attracts GST on a transactional regional fuel charge over and above the 10 cents per litre. Now, you could argue that there is a professional service that's been provided in the activity of the provision of regional land transport. The question is that GST on $130 million, well, that's about $19 million extra in GST that's paid. $150 million, well, that's $22.5 million in GST that's paid. That is paid not for the purpose of transport. That is not codified. So, and I know that there is a long-standing debate around GST on excise because it's effectively a tax on a tax. I think that should be addressed as part of our submission. It needs to be addressed in relation to Clause 65C of the bill. The issue of Clause 65ZD, this, in my reading of this bill is a Trojan horse, that it won't necessarily be Auckland Council's regional fuel tax scheme, but there will be a regional fuel tax scheme in the future where I am quite sure that the quantum of revenue required will be in excess of what can be obtained through the charging of 10 cents per litre. In the future, as more and more cars switch from, people give up fuel-powered vehicles in favour of electric vehicles, there will not be enough revenue from regional fuel tax. Councils who will be adverse to charging property rates will want to move to regional fuel tax, and they will find that it won't be an adequate source of revenue at 10 cents per litre. And the issue there, Chair, is that the bill sets down for a process by order in council to change the maximum amount. I don't think that the maximum amount should, I mean, you can reduce the maximum amount charged, in my view, but I don't think that there should be a process by order in council to go beyond 10 cents per litre. And the third point, Clause 65ZF, goes to the issue that I raised before, and I think Councillor Bartley raised the question around the figure set out in the schedule.
Administration.
The administrative charge. There is no cap on the administration. This scheme threatens to become a very expensive scheme to administer, and that is because of Clause 65ZF as it is currently written, is a cost that fully comes back to the Regional Council. So I would like to see some work on that. Now, if the intent of these matters can be addressed through other wording, fine. But I have to address, for the purpose of this submission, my concerns. So I'm putting these matters up for a vote. If others want to vote against it, fine. But for me to support this bill, I would want to see those matters addressed.
Thank you, Daniel. Sorry, Councillor.
Daniel's fine.
Just in reply, briefly, is that GST is on rates as well, so it's a debate we've been having with government ad nauseum, it feels like. The second point is from the order of council. I guess the only point I'd like to make there is that there's still a democratic process, and to get it through a government would have to actually still have to go and face the voters every 3 years, and if voters decide they don't like that sort of thing, well, we know the inevitable consequence. And clause 65 ZF, that process of negotiating the rate with the NZTA of the administration cost has been worked on now by some council staff, and they are quite confident of producing a pretty tight timeline around that and a tight outcome. It's still under process. The fact there's already a system in place means it should not be an onerous amount, but I'd actually like the staff to comment, then we'll go to you, Councillor Sayers. So Mike, or Anna? Stephanie.
I just want to clarify that clause 65ZF relates to a limitation on NZTA from bringing claims against the regional fuel taxpayer for a failure to pay or and a failure to pay penalties or interest. I think the clause that we're interested in is clause 65U, which provides that the NZTA that a council is required to pay the actual net costs and expenses of NZTA up to any limit set by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Transport. So it would just be a change in the clause.
Chair, with your indulgence, 65U needs to be amended at Roman numeral 3 with the appropriate wording to address that, because I think that there is a real concern here around the administrative cost of that if the officers are just making that adjustment now at 65U. 3?
Yep. They will do that, and concernings about the administration costs of the fuel tax. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'll just speak quickly. I don't want to reiterate the points that the Councillor Newman's just made, but just to speak in support of the amendment. The councillor used the term a Trojan horse, and I guess my concern is that we could be ordered to increase that regional, the fuel tax higher than 10 cents. And correctly, as the Chair's pointed out, that would undoubtedly go through a democratic public consultation process. However, that's emptying the Trojan horse, isn't it? That's going out there and allowing that opportunity to occur. Where I think what the amendment here is trying to do is safeguard ratepayers at this point in time that won't occur. So that's why I'm supportive. It's really there for protection of the ratepayers going forward. And just very quickly, Mr Chair, in terms of that point around the administrative costs too, I guess that's a concern. We just don't know the size of that and trying to put a cap on that. So thank you for your indulgence.
Councillor Darby.
Probably need a question on this. Maybe it's the Chief Executive or Finance. We've had a government of recent that it did increase GST. What was it, 12.5 to 15? If we had a fuel tax that we'd signal that would raise, say, 150 a year, and then you have an increase in GST.
Maximum volume.
And I'm not suggesting that, I'm not hearing that the government is intending to increase GST, but I probably want to understand, if the government did increase GST, what would the implications be for your planned spend in the city? You'd have no control over the GST changes. What would the implications be? You've already got your GST, you've nailed it, your RFT revenues, you've nailed your program down, you've done your ATAP and your Regional Land Transport Plan, and you're on track delivering, and next thing, a government changes the GST.
So the flow-on of a GST change would only be through any demand change that made to the amount of fuel purchased. So if GST were increased, as with other products, goods and services, the cost to the consumer would increase, and there may be a demand response. But apart from that, there'd be no other impact on the amount of revenue we would collect. That we would collect.
Yeah. The government would be getting more. Councillor Cooper.
Oh, just a question on GST again. So if we don't get GST with it, but then we're paying for projects and we have to declare the GST on that, and then we haven't received it, we don't, the whole quid pro quo when you can sometimes you get GST back. I'm not a GST lawyer, but how would that affect that if we're actually having to pay GST at the other end for a project, but we haven't received GST? Oh, we don't receive it anyway, do we?
No.
So yeah, so we're paying GST on something that we haven't received the GST for.
Correct.
So maybe it's asking for the GST.
The other thing we have to remember
There's no needs in this bill.
in the transport space is the financial assistance rate, the FAR rate, 51 cents, and the product for us that comes through.
Sorry, can I just apologise, Mr Chair? I've got this thing that I've got for my car, and it's got a life of its own, and I can't work out how to turn it off. What I will do is I will take it out of the room.
Thank you, Councillor.
It's a bit of a... It's going through a little...
Maximum volume.
I know. I'm going through an issue with it. We'll
Birthday was yesterday.
I think it was the councillor's birthday. It's probably a present to herself.
How much did you have to drink?
Any other questions on the amendment put forward by Councillors Newman and Sayers? Kathy. Councillors. Casey.
To staff, what do we say about 65U in our submission? Nothing. At the moment, we're just silent.
At the moment we are silent.
Right, so this doesn't really say anything, this number 3. It says to limit it to what?
Yeah,
It's negotiated.
that's the amendment.
Doesn't say anything though. Doesn't say what limit we want.
Well, you can't. So yeah, we just don't know that because it's under a series of negotiation between our council officials and the officials at NZTA, and that's happening at the moment.
So I'm presuming we're negotiating to limit it at the moment.
I would suggest definitely yes. I think it's I think 3's almost goes without saying, but Councillor Mike Lee.
Just a question to the mover and seconder. I understand the quest for transparency when we talk about these figures by including GST, but when you come down to, and that's in clause A1, when you come down to clause 2, when you talk of 10 cents per litre, well, you've got, okay, 10 cents per litre, you have that. Is that inclusive of GST or 10 cents a litre plus GST? What is the meaning of that?
That's what they're trying to sort out. It's in the, it's stipulated here.
GST's already on it.
Is that?
It's always exclusive.
I mean, it's exclusive.
Always
Exclusive?
Yeah.
I think that should be clear then. But then that ties in with clause 1.
Could I ask the officials, please, to give us some wisdom around 1A of the amendment? We're actually asking the amount to be GST inclusive. Is that beyond the scope of our powers under the legislation?
just stating that what is in there. The legislation already says that.
It would mean council would lose the money.
This thing, council, would be very difficult to actually ask for something that we have no ability to attain. So the reasonable test is coming into play in my mind, but I'm willing to take professional advice on this. While we're waiting for that, Councillor Filipaina.
No, thank you, Chair. I just want to get a clarification around the long-term plan and Auckland plan consultation, that we ended up going out with 10 cents, which excluded GST. So that's the 11.5 cents that was being out there. So in regards to 2, am I assuming not exceeding 11.5 cents per litre? Based on 1 as well, which includes GST, that's because of the consultative process we've just undertaken.
You either have one or the other, but you're
Well,
right.
that's, I'm looking at 1.
We're asking the officials
saying,
things.
let's include GST. Then if you do that, then that not exceeding 11.5 cents per litre. That's the point I'm making, hence the question.
And you're right.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's why I ask questions.
So this is, Councillor, it's getting a little bit messy. May I suggest, with your indulgence, that you talk with the staff during the lunch and recess, and perhaps come up with some words. I think we understand what you're trying to achieve, and there's probably a degree of sympathy for it, but it's the methodology of about doing that is how it's best to proceed. So I'm taking your guidance. So you can either put this to the vote, or you can talk to our team and have some inputs into the actual submission.
Which is one
Do I have a right to comment?
I get what it
Most certainly.
Look, the issue here, Chair, and I appreciate your indulgence, is, and I totally accept, you either have an inclusive or you have an exclusive. I mean, you know, I'm frankly, the way in which legislation is written up and the treatment of GST, you have it exclusive. The concern here is that this bill provides for a significantly higher impostive cost at the pump because there is a GST that this is an activity that attracts a GST because of the service. So in effect, the real cost to the ratepayer, to the motorist, will be significantly higher than 10 cents. So that needs to be addressed. With respect to clause 65D, the issue there isn't so much the GST, it is the process by which the maximum amount could change over time, and that the process is by order in council, which is a very easy way. Ministers just write the paper up and it goes to Cabinet, and Cabinet makes agrees the process, agrees the quantum, and then by order in council the Governor-General changes the maximum rate. So it's a slightly different issue, but I have a real concern that the maximum rate, whilst set out in the bill, starts at 10 cents per litre. It won't be the maximum rate forever. And by order in council, that could change to a significantly higher amount. So I would be happy to delete Roman numeral 1 and have a conversation offline, but I'm very concerned about clause 2, that's 65ZD. And I take the point from Councillor Casey, but the real issue is that it needs to be something that is included in our submission that reflects on Auckland Council's concern around the need to limit the administrative cost of this tax, because this is going to be very expensive. The bill already sets out a price tag of $1 million in the schedule. I accept that there is a conversation going on between officials, but absent some sort of restriction on the New Zealand Transport Agency to limit its cost of its professional service, I think that this will become a rather frighteningly expensive tax to administer in the future without the protection of some legislation to constrain their administration. So I'm happy to take out, and with Councillor Sayers is comfortable with it, I'm happy to take out Roman numeral 1 and have a conversation offline, but I would prefer, frankly, to address 65ZD and 65U.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Sayers? Yep. I'm going to ask our Chief Executive, with his experience in NZTA, to confirm our ability to actually work with NZTA to get the most effective net return of that fund, and also on that clause 1 part of your recommendations, Councillor. Executive.
Yeah, look, through you, Chair, we are pretty confident that we can make appropriate agreements with NZTA that would not be unreasonable. But having said that, it wouldn't be inappropriate to express some sort of concern about the administrative costs in our submission, and I don't think we need a resolution to do that. We can just agree that we'll add that to the submission points. And you can talk to the Mayor and Deputy Mayor plan to appear before the Select Committee, and no doubt they'll have a a series of, 10 to a dozen bullet points that they will want to convey to the select committee, and this could be one of them.
If this can be addressed by simply including the point in the submission, then that's fine.
Okay. So that will be added to Darley's list that we'll have at the end of
But
this.
that can drop Roman numeral 2 then.
Yep.
Nearly there.
We're nearly there, Daniel.
And your answer to 1?
And the new one, Daniel, what do you...
Not sure what
Well,
the
that's
intent was.
essential. I mean, we can if clause 65ZD2 is not amended, there is a very easy scope for cabinets in the future to ratchet up the maximum rate beyond what's stated in this bill. And I think we made the comment around in our submission, we use the word initially. We use the word initially because the initial maximum is 10 cents per litre. But that doesn't mean to say it's 10 cents per litre in perpetuity.
Thank you. I guess the only point I would make from the chair is that there is the political sensitivity that's very evident around this table this morning around these sorts of issues, and any politician advocating an increase to increase a regional's area's fuel tax would be very well aware of those political sensitivities and would have to take that into account. So we're going to be coming to the last part of this part of the amendments. So, Councillor Filipiana.
Just a question on this one now. Can you explain the process that has to take place with the order of council if we wish, if we end up wanting to, or the government wishes to increase the cents per litre?
Certainly, well, that would be a recommendation of the Minister, a decision of the Minister that the Governor-General would give effect to by order in council.
Right, and I think there was a question asked earlier, is there or will there be a consultative process that has to take place?
For variation.
No.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Well, not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Necessarily.
Yeah.
Good.
Councillor Hills.
My view on this is that I think it states our intention. We're not asking for more than 10 cents plus the GST, and the government will either decide to use our submission or they will decide to keep it open for the ease of future decisions made by other regional councils. So to me it states our intent that we're only asking for 10 cents, so I don't see it as a big hurdle for anyone to support, me personally.
Any further speakers? Councillor Darby.
Look, the mover and seconder have given reference to clauses in the bill, but when I go to those clauses, it refers me to other sections of the bill and then to other sections of the bill. To make a decision on this, I really need a whole paper. I got confused on the first one, to be honest. So I really think that it would be entirely premature to make a decision on this unless there was a paper helping me navigate through the interrelated parts of the bill, because I've crossed into 3 sections so far by going to 65ZD, and I'm no further ahead, Chair. And how I can go aye or against on this is beyond me. Well, the aye anyway.
I have a degree of discomfort along the same lines as you, Councillor. Would have much rather this come through a bit earlier.
Well, it did come up in the
concluding
workshop,
comments, Councillor Ewan?
Well, thank you, Chair. I mean, I did raise it at the workshop the other day.
Yes, you did.
When this matter was discussed. I mean, you have to start with clause 65C, which states the requirements relating to the regional fuel tax scheme, and 65C3, the maximum rate of a regional fuel tax under the RFT scheme is 10 cents per litre. So then you go down, you read clause 65 ZD, and it is. I thought it was relatively clear. It states that in order under subsection 1, that reduces the maximum rate of regional fuel taxes on blah, blah, blah. It sets out that the Governor-General can make a change to the maximum amount by order in council. So this is actually not about Auckland Council's regional fuel tax scheme. This is a process that allows for the maximum amount to change over time, effectively with a fairly truncated process whereby a paper goes to Cabinet with the Minister's recommendation approved, and then it's waved through by the Governor-General. So I have a concern about that. Yes, the maximum amount of regional fuel tax might be lower than 10 cents per litre, or it might not be. It might be a different amount again, it might be higher. And I think that I don't want this regional fuel tax bill as proposed by the government today to be an easy way for governments to hike the rate in the future. So if others are unclear about that, then I guess I'll have to vote their conscience, but I'm clear about what this could mean. That is why the submission states 10 cents per litre fuel tax initially. The word initially is very important here. So I'm comfortable with the amendment. It's important to me because I'm not sure that I want to support the bill in its current form without that change at 65ZD.
Thank you, councillors. There's no other points. I presume you want to put by division, councillor?
Well, it doesn't really worry me. I mean, my position's clear on this.
Yep.
I'm happy if people want a division on it.
Just put this by division, I think would be safest. The amendment is there. It's been moved and seconded. Staff, call a division, please.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
No.
Councillor Bartley.
Yes.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Councillor Collins.
For.
Councillor Cooper.
No, I need more information.
Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Filipaina.
For.
Councillor Hills.
For.
Councillor Hulse.
No.
Councillor Lee.
Aye.
Councillor Newman.
For.
Councillor Sayers.
For.
Councillor Simpson. For. Councillor John Walker.
For.
Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yes.
Councillor Watson.
Yes.
So it's carried.
It's passed. So it now becomes part of the substantive. We'll now continue the debate on the substantive motion. Speakers.
Well, hold on. Excuse me.
Councillor Simpson.
How do we know, it's already talking about the substantive, but we haven't yet seen from staff whether they've incorporated our suggestions yet.
So at the end of this debate, I'm going to call upon staff to read out the list of notes they've taken from the discussion thus far, which will be incorporated into the submission.
Well, with respect, if we don't get some of the changes that we have requested, we may not vote for the resolution. So surely you'll get them to do that.
They will read out at the end of the debate the information items that they've taken from the discussion thus far, and they will say they will be incorporating that into the submission. Right. Given the timeframes that we've got, we don't have the ability to come back with you to a new submission. It has to be to Parliament by tomorrow.
Point of order,
Speakers.
Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Casey.
I think what my colleague was asking for was the changes to be read out now ahead of the debate. Is that a problem?
That's if they're ready for doing
If
that.
they're ready, yeah.
I don't think they are, but
Well, certainly I can read out the changes, the confirmed changes.
Yeah.
And there are 5. We've taken notes of all of your comments, but first of all, Councillor Casey, as a result of your direction, we will be amending the submission on clause 65L. So rather than supporting the Minister's ability to terminate, we will just be noting that. Secondly, we will be including in the submission an explicit statement that Auckland Council wants the ability to exclude certain specific geographical areas from the regional fuel tax, for example, Great Barrier Island. Excuse me. Thirdly, we will be including an express statement that we intend to write to the Minister on our what Auckland Council wants in terms of rebates and further exemptions through the regulations. Fourthly, we will be including a statement about limiting the administrative costs of NZTA to what is reasonable. Fifthly, the amendment that's just been agreed to 65ZD.
The cap on it, yeah.
Then there were a number of other points that were made, so first of all, Councillor Simpson asked whether we should build in a point questioning the transparency on central government and use of fuel excise taxes. Is it the direction that we should be including that statement?
I believe so, because the timing is difficult.
Secondly, Councillor Simpson asked about changing in the introductory section where we say that the purpose of the fuel tax is to enable the funding of transport infrastructure projects that could not be funded or not funded within the desired timetable, the wording further enabled.
And taking out that would otherwise be delayed or not funded?
Yes, noting I did respond that was a reflection of the legislation. So that wording, as I say, is a direct lifting from the legislation, that the policy of the legislation is to enable projects that could not otherwise be funded or funded within the timeframes.
Why else would we do it?
So can I receive some direction on that, please?
Yeah.
This thing, we'll have speakers on those items. I think the first one I have is Councillor Mike Lee.
I think it would be in the best interests of this council, given we've been through a formal consultation process, keeping faith with our community and providing Parliament with due diligence, that we refer to the consultation process we've been through and the results of that consultation process, rather than somebody else in the community coming out and it becoming a political football, perhaps. Parliament is, after all, a political place. So I think we should be transparent about that we have undertaken a consultation process on this matter, and here are the results.
That's not what I said.
Mike?
The results of the long-term plan consultation are not yet available and have not been presented to this body, and that's planned for the 9th of May. So,
well, I think we need to signal that very point.
We could certainly include that we have undergone public consultation on this.
Otherwise, it looks like we've had a consultation, had put it in a completely different compartment altogether, and we've gone on to this legislation. The two things are absolutely interconnected.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, if we're just talking about the 2 points that I brought up, I just want to be really, really clear, because this may sway my vote either way. Again, I just want to confirm that it's about the transparency for the consumer, for the Auckland and for the ratepayer. And we're not just questioning the transparency around the government and their tax, their excise tax, but we should be asking for clarity around this, because this is a bit of a partnership between Auckland Council and the government, right? But two people need to be open with each other for this deal to work. One is, we're being quite open and saying, look, our submission is, maximum of 10 cents plus GST, rah-de-rah-de-rah, but there's no transparency on the government side. And at the end of the day, a combination of two factors will affect Aucklanders. So I don't think our submission should just be questioning. Our submission should ask for clarity. Because at the end of the day, 10 cents on top of what? And I think it's a really key point. And that's been the big backlash that many people have received, or certainly I have anyway in my community around, look, you told us it was going to be 10 cents or 11.5 cents. Now it's going to be 25 cents. You know, who's right? What are we doing here? How can we know if we're being asked our opinion again? How can we know? So,
Councillor, you're asking for us on our submission to request clarity from the Crown on its process on its excise tax increases going forward.
Yes, absolutely. At the same time that they're asking for clarity from us.
It's probably not an unreasonable request. Anyone violently opposed to that?
I would totally support it.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Councillor.
I really don't like doing this sort of stuff on the hoof, folks, but the time
Well, I did bring it up at the workshop,
yeah, I know.
Mr. Chairman, and with respect, if you ask a question, you expect those answers to come back before the debate.
So, but we are under huge time pressures here, so, but thank you for your forbearance in this manner.
It's clear in the GPS anyway.
Any other
You haven't got the GPS.
comments before we put the substantive?
Just acting me,
Hang on. Councillor.
Sorry, to the substantive.
To the substantive?
To the substantive, Deputy Mayor.
Yep. So have we finished with the inputs? Councillor Darby.
Just want to be really clear, because once we go through this gate, we're away. So we are going to ensure that we ask for not just consequential OPEX to new capital, it's OPEX, so it allows our optimisation program, which may not necessarily require new capital. As I raised before, have we covered that base?
So this is where we'd require your direction. So the current legislation would allow optimisation projects, but only where they are of capital nature.
New capital.
Yes.
Yeah.
Capital investment. Yeah.
That's still a problem. So if you go back to the interim transport levy, and that would have allowed you to do a lot more. I'm not talking about the quantum equivalence, but it would have allowed you to do more in some ways than the regional fuel tax.
So the way I read it,
That's right.
Councillor Darby, is that, and please staff correct me if I'm wrong, the word capital here may mean the augmentation of an existing program to something that is better or has a greater degree of intelligence to it to give a better transport proficiency in the system. That's how I'm reading it. I stand to be corrected, because that's been consistent all the way through the interim transport levy, the ATAP process, and now this.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that reflects the GPS though. That does not reflect the GPS, so that doesn't sync. I mean, if you go to the GPS, it talks about to support critical transport connections and make the best use of the current network, brackets maintenance, resilience and demand management and mode shift. That's really important.
So perhaps we should put in our submission to referring to the GPS on transport would be a cover-all.
If we can't pay for that out of the regional fuel tax, we've got a problem. We've got a big problem.
Through the chair, yes. I mean, just to be clear, the way the legislation is constructed is it is related to capital projects and operating expenditure related to capital projects. That is the way the government has chosen to constrain what this revenue can be used for. But we will take your direction as to whether you would like to include comment on
I think we
that
need some input from Strategy Director at Auckland Transport on this as well at some point, and maybe it just comes back. We look at the words, you know, I think it's delegated to you, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, we can do that. I think it's a matter of interpretation. Councillor Newman, you have a question, I understand?
Just to confirm what this regional fuel tax is. This regional fuel tax is a hypothecated fuel tax, which means that that the revenue raised is dedicated revenue from a specific source, i.e. fuel, for a particular expenditure. And it doesn't provide for wide scope for all of the activities that people are suddenly identifying as I'd like to have picked up. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the government in the drafting of the legislation has been prudent to ensure that the narrow application of the revenue derived from a hypothecated tax does not provide for people to come back and say, well, look, we'd actually like to add this project in, because it's not something that has been identified for a particular expenditure purpose. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you.
And I should just add, I mean, there have been discussions between council and ministry officials, and the ministry it's been quite deliberate, the requirements around the proposal and on what the revenue can be spent.
Yep, quite a different beast from a wider interim transport levy. Thank you. Reserve my right to speak.
Yep. Thank you.
So can I ask a supplementary?
Hang on. You have an order here. Councillor Watson, you have a question?
No, I'm just going to speak to the motion.
Councillor Hills?
Yeah, so my question was, and it's probably to Councillor Darby's point a bit, but so the way we had, so the last release we had of ATAP, we were still planning to do a regional fuel tax despite what government we had. And at that point, am I right that it was 25.9 billion that was released by Simon Bridges, and he said there was a $5.9 billion funding gap. This is to fill some of the funding gap. If that 150 plus potentially 150 from NZTA is to fund some of our works, surely that frees up our
money for other works.
So I think what we're getting confused as, yes, we have to name the projects, but this will also, what I'm seeing is free up the capital or the operating budget to fund the other works, because it's the whole point of ATAP was one fund together with government to fund all of our transport infrastructure, whether it's capital, operating, renewal, maintenance. So aren't we?
You are correct.
Yeah. So we're filling the gap. So surely it doesn't necessarily matter on our side of things where that money comes from, as long as we can fund it. Is that where we're heading?
Yep. Councillor Simpson.
Sorry, just supplementary to Newman, Derby, Hills, and that's the specific project. I go back to, I mean, I brought up a number of questions, and I've only heard that two that you're interested in including. So I just want to give one more plug for the projects. Should be set projects, maybe not. I don't necessarily agree with the RFT scheme. That's more general. It's not specific. I just don't understand why we're not sticking to absolute projects and going into that wide, like road safety projects, which theoretically could be or should be covered from normal rate paying funded.
So, Councillor,
if it's a set targeted rate for set targeted projects, why are we challenging the term project?
So the actual project list that the fuel tax and stuff will be identified through the ATAP process over the next week or two, and then the regional land transport plan was the final document. That lists everything that we do. So I'd love for it to be around the other way, but just the way the legislation's dropped, the way that the GPS and the ATAP negotiations have been delayed a bit, has caused this sort of conundrum.
And
however, the philosophical point that Councillor Hills makes is absolutely correct. This is adding a potential, subject to vote, $300 million thereabouts to our annual transport CapEx program. And that is enabling to bring projects forward that are on the master list in the RLTP. It's really as simple as that when it comes down to it. It means we can get more things done and more things moving, literally, faster. It's not perfect, and I know you're a process lady and process, but we are dealing with what is the reality we are facing from the government at the moment.
I suppose I'd rather do it once and do it properly.
Any further questions? Councillor Lee.
Can I just confirm, that, Mr. Acting Mayor, that I'm becoming increasingly worried about this. The more I think about it, is that it's important that the present consultation process with our community, with our ratepayers, is acknowledged in the submission. Otherwise, the appearance is that we're trifling with the consultation process with our own community and taking it all for granted, that we don't have the results is unfortunate, but obviously there are time constraints that are due to the government's requirements, not ours. But I think at least we need to be very, very clear about how much importance we place on our consultation process, particularly the one on the regional fuel tax. To not mention it at all would leave the council open to criticism and possibly even legal action. So let's show due respect to that process.
Thanks, Councillor. We will certainly do that at the time of, we've notified at this time, and then it's now submission to the Act, but we'll also be obviously referencing our public consultations extensive processes when we apply to have.
No, but I think we need to do that now and tell them that we're consulting, and we need to acknowledge it.
Yeah, we'll set up that train, Councillor. I think it's a good point you make. Thank you. Okay, open statements on the substantive. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, and I'll be very quick. I support this submission, and I thank the various councillors I think have improved the content of that submission. But I think it's important to note, and I think you've already alluded to it, and certainly I think this was what Councillor Lee was getting at, and it is important that this is really quite a distinct process, quite separate from our consultative one in terms of decision making. We know that, and it's certainly worth knowing, even within that consultative process, that it was conducted under the semblance of addressing congestion, which is bound to garner quite a bit of support across Auckland, of course, but done without identifying specific projects to be delivered. We all know that it's been a recurring theme, and especially how the actual allocation of the fuel tax addresses issues of fairness and equity across the region. That's obviously a consideration, and it was also done, Deputy Mayor, without the knowledge of the government's plan to essentially increase fuel by up to 12 cents a litre also over the next 3 years. So I would just say yes, support the submission, but those two incredibly important considerations, as Councillor Lee have said, have yet to be addressed, and will be I suggest, very important elements in the final decision whether or not to proceed or not. So I just wanted to put that on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Nicely summed up. Further speakers? Councillor Walker.
I just want to echo the comments of my fellow ward member, and that particularly goes to the political sensitivity of this issue. Unlike the rates and so many other things, our residents and our ratepayers and the people that are paying this fuel tax are going to think every time they fill up, and they may think about us and how we've acted around this and how Auckland Council's acted. So this is a politically charged issue that's not going to go away. They're going to want to see value, they're going to want to see equity, they're going to want to see something in their area.
No disagreement there. Councillor Newman.
It will be necessary for everyone around this table to understand the limits of this hypothecated tax, because it is just that, it is hypothecated for a specific purpose. This should not be something that, if this legislation passes, people say, oh, that's great, we can basically bring a smorgasbord of renewals back to the table and look to get this fuel tax to cover that. This is quite project specific. If this revenue is not in addition to what we currently have, because of course concurrent to this is a proposal to repeal the interim transport levy. And so whilst the interim transport levy provides for quite wide scope for what we can do, including renewals, this does not, and that people will see that actually this is going to be quite constraining, not liberating, because we have a very tightly defined hypothecated tax, as it should be, and we will substitute the wider scope of the interim transport levy for that tightly defined hypothecated tax. So I think that the submission is a better submission for the discussion here today. GST might be a discussion for another meeting another day, but if people think that a regional fuel tax is going to be the answer to our revenue problems, whilst at the same time removing the interim transport levy, we will potentially be no better off. In fact, we may be worse off when it comes to renewals of our roading infrastructure, which is going to be crumbling under the pressure of more cars in the future.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further comments before we put... Oh, I'm sorry. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Look, I agree that the submission is probably better for having the debate today. Public consultation has shown that they are open to an RFT being introduced, but I suppose my problem still with our submission is that I don't think it gives me or Aucklanders the confidence that it has both the financial, budgetary and practical details associated with it embedded in the legislation as part of our submission. I really welcome the fact that we are asking government to put their amount of increase of tax on the table at the same time. I think that's a positive step. I can't believe we're not confirming a cap on the administration cost to limit, for me, to allow a submission that goes through that has an open-ended budgetary concern for us, I think is not wise. My real issue, though, is the fact that this is being rushed through to achieve an aim for us that we don't know the detail for. So that is my concern. And I think the submission, if we waited 12 months and had the submission with all the details, with sort of cost-benefit analysis from MOT, other things with it, I think I would have felt more comfortable. I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't have a regional fuel tax, but I do feel that our submission is rushed and unprepared to meet a time frame as opposed to good due process that would surround it in a normal set of circumstances. So my concerns are both financial and as far as open transparency regarding what it will support and pay for. We don't have that detail. So to that end, I can't support it, and those are my concerns.
Thank you. Councillor Hills.
Yes, thank you. I think that this is a good, reasonable submission. The government is doing this because we asked. The history of this is long time coming. We were aware in the first day tap there was a $4 billion gap. Then it increased. Simon Bridges announced in August last year that it had increased by 1.9 over 1 year. It had increased. So we had a $5.9 billion budget gap. We had $20 billion worth of committed projects, committed money, but we still needed that 5.9. Within ATAP, it's not a line-by-line project-based thing. It says things like safety improvements, route optimization, mass transit, road layout. It doesn't have a lolly scramble of individual tiny things around, because we know over 10 years we're going to need certain things based on what we've done before, but it's not line-by-line project. Just like with our own renewal budgets, our own operating budgets within Auckland Council, we have sports fields, blah. We don't list them all because it's not, to cost out all those designs over time for 10 years would be a ridiculous thing to do. I think that this is so important that we are strong on this, because the government could easily go, okay, well, Auckland's not really worrying. Auckland doesn't see this as a priority, and Auckland doesn't want to fix their congestion. So this is one bit, but it's not. We're not going to fill the whole gap, even with this. So yes, the interim transport levy covered about 60 million a year. This is going to get up to 150 plus the 150 from government. But I think it's important that we don't send a mixed message to government that we don't need or want this funding. I think people have been asking for decades for Auckland to fix the traffic situation and invest in safety improvements. Things like we're having one person killed or seriously injured on our roads every day in Auckland. That's just pedestrians and cyclists. So I think if we are sending a mixed message or concerned about, you know, we're going to find this money magically somewhere else, we're kidding ourselves. So I think it's, you know, we've added a lot of things in here, but I also think we need to make sure that we're sending to the government that we actually want this, because it's politically hard for them as well to introduce anything that costs money. But we have to do it. It's our time constraints too. By audit, we have to do our long-term plan and our budget at that time. So it's our timeline that is also forcing us into this situation. But whatever government was, we were in this situation, whether it was tolling, petrol tax or whatever, but we were doing this anyway. And I'm a little concerned that we're sending a bit of a, oh, well, you know, we don't need this when we know that we have to fill that gap. And this is only going to go not even halfway to that. So thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Further comments? Councillor Filipaina.
I'm not going to cover much. Councillor Hill's covered what I wanted to say, but I will say, however, that the process that we've had to go through wasn't the process that we, the time frame, sorry, that we had. It was put on us by the government. And don't forget, let's recall a lot of other legislation that was pushed by previous governments. And let's be aware as well that those previous governments pushed legislation on us in the time frames that they put in.
The unitary plan.
And we had to go with, as my late mother always used to say, go with the flow. So, you know, from my perspective, and Councillor Hills, with his first statement, covered it, which is, this is something that we've wanted, we've consulted on it, and we're at this stage now, and the time frames were those from the central government and not from us. However, I do want to acknowledge the staff in regards to what we have in front of us, and the acting mayor said it sort of, I believe, sort of summed it up in regards to these submissions, and that it had to be done. And again, I just wanted to acknowledge the staff. I will be supporting it, and I think the fact that, as Councillor Hill said, generating more money than what we did with the interim transport levy. So again, staff, thank you so much. Kia ora.
Thank you, Councillor. So just a very quick summation from the Chair, and that is, we have had intergenerational underinvestment in transport in this city, and we are taking some brave steps to try and fill some of those gaps. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy. And as we've seen from the discussions this morning, these things are politically charged because we're asking Aucklanders to pay. But the alternative is a 10% plus rates increase if we are going to start to do something on our multiple transport networks. We don't have a huge amount of choices. Rates or some form of user pays, like a fuel tax, albeit imperfect. So I urge you all to think about future generations and what we can do to help start the process to delivering a less congested Auckland into the future and a safer transport moding system into the future, and a better environmental system for transport into the future, because that's what we need to do. We need to be thinking about the future. Councillors, you've seen the recommendations and the amendments that have been added to them. I now propose to put those to a voice vote. I'll remove the recommendations as listed. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Contrary?
No.
No.
We'll note Councillor Simpson and Sayers as against, and Councillor Walker? Yeah. The motion is passed. Thank you very much. Lunch is at 12:30 or after. Do you wish to proceed now to the next item?
Yes.
Okay, we will move then to item 11.